Okay, this is part 2 of the demonstration painting the figure in monochrome. At this point I have a pretty well developed underdrawing, just drawn directly with thinned out oil paint. Next step is to kind of lay in the large and broad aspects of the tonality, including the background. So I'm going to show you how I attempt that part. I've got my palette laid out with 5 different values. This is not going to be sufficient to get every single little last nuance value, but it helps to have a really simple start to build those more nuanced tonal relationships. So I'm not sure if you can see this here, but I've got my setup here with different values, 90%, 70%, 50%, 30%, and 10%. Each of them has its own brush. This really helps keeps these values separated. Back here. Okay, and the reason why that's important is you want them to blur only when intentionally. Otherwise, you will lose the differentiation, and this will oftentimes flatten out the form. I'm going to start with the 90%, which will serve as the background. And I've got a round brush here. Often the highest highlights and the darkest darks are going to be the most detailed parts of the painting. And so I'll use a brush that is more pointed for that reason, so I can get a little bit more specific. I'm going to start laying in a value just until it fills up the background. I might overlap the drawing just a little bit so that I'm painting into the background. I've got the paint thinned out slightly. This is a 90%. You can see how much dimmer it is already than the paper. This is good. I want to bring down the value so that I have a good amount of contrast in the halftones. Okay, so I'm just going to start by trying to fill in as much as I can. Now, there's a lot of this value within the figure, but it exists mainly in the light areas, so I might bring those in as well. It will look very choppy and strange until the majority of the painting is kind of filled in, and so you have to keep that in mind, that it's going to look a little bit strange until everything is put in the right place. When you're working at home, you don't need to worry about taping off the edges or anything. I really prefer that the paintings go right to the edges so that you can make the largest figure painting within the composition that you can. So don't worry so much about going over the drawing. You want the brushwork to kind of overlap. So what I'm going to be doing is recovering that drawing as I go, just painting wet into wet paint. Make sure you mix enough paint. One of the most common problems is that students don't make enough of what they need, and so they have to stop halfway through and try and match the tone, and that's hard to do, and it takes time. So it's better to mix more than you think you need, especially when you're working with a grayscale. At the end of the day, you can always fold these values into a more basic halftone gray and then reuse it later for something else. I know you're going to be working on something for a number of days. It's always a good idea to have a little bit extra left over. Okay. I like to start with the lights. I mean, really I'm starting with the middle tones, but I'd like to start laying in with the lights because from my experience, gradations work best when you're painting a darker color into a lighter color. It doesn't really work as well the other way around for some reason. I'm not sure why that's the case, but so I'll usually think about regions of value and try to start each region with the lightest average that applies to it. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but I try to think about what the most average, obvious tone will be for each of the shape regions. For example, the lightest average value is here on his chest. It's going to be kind of gradated as it reaches the shadow masses and turns around the edges. So I'm going to start here and paint the darker halftones into it, on top of it, so that this lighter value shines through. This lay-in can take quite a bit of time just to get the canvas covered, but until you get the white of the canvas or paper covered, it's very difficult to be able to evaluate what you're doing from a tonal perspective. Again, don't worry if you go over. The edges of the form are going to be, I use the word negotiated, back and forth between positive and negative shapes. So if you don't know what I mean by positive and negative, I'm talking about, for example, the elbow in the background. The elbow here is the positive shape, the background is the negative shape. I'm thinning the paint slightly just to spread it thin. It's good to build your surfaces deliberately. It's much easier to control a thinner layer of paint than a thick, juicy layer of paint. So build your layers up gradually and try not to get ahead of yourself in terms of only keep the paint as thick as you can control. As you get more confident and more skilled, you'll be able to increase the amount of paint you're painting with and get really cool effects with fusion of edges and thick impasto mark making and stuff like that. So I'm just going right to the edge of the paper, covering up the grid lines. They've served their purpose, so I don't need them anymore. Moving around the figure, he's casting a shadow to his proper right side on the background. And so I'm actually going to be gradating downward from this 90% to probably a 50%, so quite a bit darker. I try to think about the simplest way to apply the brushwork such that it gets the effect that I want. Try to get it as directly and with little fuss as possible. There's plenty of time to fuss later. We'll keep moving. I noticed that there's not much of this 90% down here. Maybe a little bit here in the thigh. That's about it. Because keep in mind the light is falling off into shadow as it moves down his form. So I'm leaving it blank because I might as well draw it with a value that is closer to the way it appears. Remember that lights and shadows are relative, so what appears to be a highlight on the knee, locally to the knee, might be a dimmer value than the highlight on the head, for example, because the whole context is dimmer down here. So try to keep that global sensibility, try to keep that awareness of the full value range. And creating a map where these different values belong. Almost got the painting covered. It's good because I'm running it out a little bit, but I think I got plenty. For me, I've got a big panel here. It's a metal panel behind my canvas, so I can push pretty hard. If you're working on a canvas, it's going to flex and it's going to change the way the mark looks. I mean, I love it all. It's all really interesting, the way that the paint behaves on different surfaces. So just try to engage with it as much as you can. Try to explore the full range of possibilities with whichever you decide to use, whether it be paper or canvas or panel. As a general rule, I like to use the largest brush that will do the job. This is a really good rule for beginners. It's very easy to think that you need to get into the fine brushes, but skillful painters don't need that small brushes. They can use larger brushes to get small effects. I talked about using the layering aspect of the paint to get small shapes. I'll explain a little bit more about that. But that is how really proficient painters use large brushes, is they use positive and negative aspects of shapes to kind of craft specific smaller shapes with a brush. All right. Let's try and get this all the way covered. once the paint is on the surface, you can kind of move it around, at least while it's wet. So use that to your advantage. This is one great thing about oil painting that is not really available to people who paint in acrylic or watercolor, is that you know, you can change the way the mark looks after you've already placed it. Looks like I need to charge my iPad, so I'm going to pull the plug here and put it here. I've got my iPad set up so it is adjacent to the canvas. I'm not sure if you can see it here, but it's kind of clipped to the image with the grid right next to where I'm working. I find this to be a really useful way, especially when your goal is to kind of translate. Okay, here we go. Great. Again, paint is easiest to use when you work it into itself. So keep that in mind when you're working. Try not to stop short at the edges of shapes, but paint over them and then recover the edges after the fact. Okay, all the way around the figure here. So I gotta get the background too behind his feet. So I can use the negative shapes to kind of further refine the contours of the positive shapes, because the paint will occlude or cover up what's underneath it, especially when you're using a powerful white like titanium. It has a very strong hiding power or opacity. It's very high tinting strength too, so like it's really easy to cover over, and that I think that is a helpful thing. I'm going to bring this down to his hip here. There's a little bit of a gradient at this point. I'm going to kind of come in here with a deeper value. With this lighter value shining through the edges of the gaps between the legs of the chair, wherever you see the value appear, lay it down there. Just because something is white, like for example, the white towel that he's sitting on, does not mean that it will be pure white. Everything is going to be in relationship to everything else. So you have to really keep that in mind, that it is a relationship that you're trying to establish. Just because it appears to be white or is locally white, it does not mean that in the lighting conditions it will be white. Okay. Okay, I'm going to leave this brush here, and I'm going to step down into a deeper value, probably going with 70%. When you're gradating from light to dark, try to do it gradually. Looks like my paper's on sticking from the tape. Okay, so first, look how much deeper the 70% looks. So this looks pretty rough at this point, but if you work it into the edges, you should be able to make it a seamless transition, which is kind of what I'm working on. Okay, go across the boundaries and work one into the other until the edge disappears. From my memory here, it seems like the values on the top of the shoulder are probably closer to 70%. So again, I'm gradating by just laying it right on top of the initial mass. Give your shadows a little bit of turning, give them a little bit of value transition before you reach that shadow mass. This is what happens as the form is turning towards the shadow. Although the edges on the cast shadow is going to be much sharper, so there'll be less values at some of these transitions than you think. I think this is all 70% in here. So sometimes what you can do is you can paint these lighter shadow values, even though you know you're going to go even darker. This will give you a little more room to wiggle. It will also allow you to get the reflected lights. The reflected lights are, indirect, bouncing off of another form, shining into a form, and it's really easy to exaggerate those. So you want to kind of underpaint your shadows with a lighter value, if possible, so that you can make sure that you're stepping down deliberately into the shadows and not going too quickly without considering how the values relate. I'm having a hard time with this tape unsticking, so I need to put a piece of tape in. That's better. Okay, where was I? Let's go back in with 70. So in other words, I'm going to underestimate the lights and the shadows. I'm going to underestimate the values with the idea that kind of undershoot it, and then I'll kind of slowly bring it to the value that I think it needs to be. Oftentimes the shadows are going to be darkest where they meet the terminator, or where the light transitions into shade. Sometimes the reflected light gives it the illusion that it's being illuminated after that transition point. So this 70% is the reflected light under the arm. Nothing gets much brighter than 70% here on the chest. So when I'm comparing the light on the upper ribcage here, I have to look at the background and that it compares to. If I look only at the positive form without considering the negative, it's really easy to exaggerate. And that's what I want to stay away from. I don't want to exaggerate. I want to try and get the values just as they appear, not any brighter or any darker. Great thing about paint is I can always paint right back into or on top of something if it's not quite there. So it's a really fluid paint, or a lot of paint, will help you get some sharp edges. But again, we're not restricted by only painting in the positive. We can paint in the negative as well. So when I'm painting an edge, like the edge of his belly here, if I want to sharpen it up, I can also sharpen it up from the outside in. And this might appear to be too dark, but it's all right. I'm going to keep going and adding more values to kind of give more variety as I go. It looks like the highlights in the leg, on the leg, are about 70-80%. these values are almost the same. So I'm going to kind of paint them as if they disappear. In other words, I'm not going to bring any more clarity to something. If it appears vague or indistinct, I want to paint it so that it looks indistinct. So I know this isn't quite looking exactly like the photograph, and that's okay. So this is a necessary step where I need to lay in these values and work them out. So I have that kind of forethought in my mind. I know what I'm going for, even though it takes time for it to appear like how I want it to. It's really a good exercise to work direct and quickly, especially when we have a model in front of us. It looks like this staff at the lightest point is probably a 70%, so I could probably come in just with this here and paint it. Now, I'm working from an illuminated screen. It's very different than working from a printout, and so I'm dealing with light being emitted from the screen. It's going to change the way that the values appear, and so I have to take this into account. It may not be as bright as I'm seeing it because it's being illuminated. The more layers that I add into this painting, the more it's going to sit on top of the surface, and so it will feel a lot wetter than I have it now, which it feels pretty dry because it's being pulled into the surface of the paper. It's very much like watercolor paper. The hand is going to be dimmer in value. So again, I'm not worried. I'm going to lose a little bit of it, but I will recover it later. Here we go. Now that I've got more information here, may bring it down even further into the middle tone range. The values that are in between, I can always mix them as small separate submixtures. But I'm still sticking to the 5 initial tones that I've mixed. And you'll see here as I start laying them on top of each other, it gives the illusion that the form is turning. Now I'm working with a 50%, so you can see how this stands next to the values here. Notice that as I touch the canvas, it's going to mix with the previous value. That is a really helpful thing. So you can, depending on your pressure, you can vary the way it mixes. Get this a little bit darker here. My goal still is to kind of cover the white of the canvas. Let's move around. I know I've got to go darker in here. Make sure that you step back often to get a real clear sense of what you're doing, and you will not be able to see some of these things if you're too close. Pay the most attention to the terminators. This is really where you get the strong effect of light, is convincing the eye that it's transitioning into shadow. It looks as though a lot of the values within the shadow here, especially like under his nipple, are probably more like 50% inside here. They're just surrounded by shadow values. So it's important to see the contour of the outline of the body, like the silhouette, but it's also important to see the contours of the shadow shapes or masses. Like, it's really important to see them. They're going to be a lot less distinct. They're more like cloud shapes. So it really helps to blur your eyes, squint your eyes to see them. I find it helpful just to keep moving, to just keep going as quickly as you can. I mean, try to be deliberate and try to be specific, but at the same time, just move fast. Like, don't give yourself any time to kind of get stuck or tunnel vision. Just keep moving. If something is eluding you, like if it is unclear how something is, just move on to something else that is clear, and then in time it will become, you'll be able to discover it, what's going on. Sometimes it just takes time to see it. This is more like a 50% in here. I'm not going to be painting his tattoos, but his tattoo is in here somewhere. This kind of stuff will become more intuitive as you practice. But it's really helpful when we're working from the model to have this study underway so that you know how to approach it. Okay, this is a lot darker. There's a phenomenon in painting called lost and found edges, which is really exciting, just from a shape or gestalt perspective, where the edge of a form kind of disappears when it becomes similar to a background form or background value, and then you find out where it contrasts again and punctuate it. It's exciting for the edges of form to kind of disappear and reappear. We'll talk about that more specifically when we study this gestalt. So just sticking to the 5-color or 5-tone palette for as long as possible. And then finishing the painting, I might add some really specific mixtures that are not common in other places to make it something really distinct. So again, undershooting the values here. I know I'm going to get darker in the leg, but I want to get this undertone correct. And again, I'm looking also at the contrast between the distant and the near shape. It's almost covered. I want to make sure that I get the shadow on the floor here. I'm going to paint the goddamn stool as well. I really don't want to, but I'm going to. Let's see. You can keep these brushes loaded with the colors that you're using in between your knuckles, kind of like Wolverine. So for example, I could have these brushes loaded on standby, the 90%, 70%, just ready to go. Oftentimes when I'm painting for life, you don't want to have to think too much about what color you're grabbing. Just want to reach for it and know where it is. So try to keep your palette organized and try to be systematic in terms of how you approach it so that you don't have to think twice. You know, all your attention can be focused on the model. Shadows are very blurry things, so I'm going to make sure that I'm raking the paint through itself. Use the hair of the bristle to your advantage. Got about 15 more minutes before I'll stop the second portion. May come back into the face too. Now the head has, especially the face, has a much lighter value, somewhere between the 90 and 70. So obviously that would be an 80. So I'm going to mix that in between these two colors on my palette. Something in between. I'm not so worried about eyebrows at this point. Again, that stuff becomes like the writing on the birthday cake. I just want to get the basic values down. Highlights will be placed on top later. When the model's breaking and stuff, you know, during class time, it's a really good time to bring some organization back to your palette. That's the point when things start to go south in your painting, is as the form is being developed, your organization is like inversely becoming less and less organized. And so every time the model breaks, bring some order back to your palette, simplify a value, clean a brush, do something to kind of maintain that sense of order. That value might be too dark. Let's bring some more light in here. If you don't like value that you placed. I'm not really happy about covering over the light here. Just take a clean blade, like wipe it off until it's totally clean, and just plant it down, use the edge and just scrape it off. And then wipe off the blade. Every time you touch the canvas, it should have a clean blade. But it's a really great way to remove paint without destroying the drawing. Okay. Notice that there's a real sharp transition here. This makes his shoulder look angled, when in reality it's very round. The deltoid is very round. So all I have to do is place more values at this transition point. And I can squint my eyes to see the shapes that the lights are making. The more values that exist, that transition, the more round the form will look. So right now I'm painting with kind of an 85 or 80%. You can see it's just slightly lighter than the 70. This is good. This is a submixture that I made in between those two values on my palette. Be generous with the paint that you use. Like, it doesn't have to be out of control, but try to use enough paint that it can be shaped and moved around after the fact. If your painting is too thin or stingy, you won't have much to work with. So let the paint be fairly thick and fresh. And again, I'm thinking about the volume as I work, as I lay the brushwork down, thinking about the way that it's best to convince the eye that things are turning around. Oh, looks like I'm losing my tape again. Just by adding slightly lighter values in these areas, I can give more of a sense of volume. Step down back to the initial tone that I was painting with in the beginning. I'm going to see if I can develop some of these shadow masses to be deeper. This is one of the darkest shadows in here, so I don't think I'm dark enough. Watch how I shape and clean up the edge of this elbow just by using the negative shape. So I can use the positive and negative shapes to kind of sculpt. Just by varying the pressure or the load on the brush, I can make lighter or darker values. Again, I'm kind of undershooting the shadow range, and I'm going to get another step down into this mass at his sternum, which is a fairly dark mass. but I want more paint on the canvas. I also think about keeping the brushwork as simple as possible. Sometimes that means summarizing work that I've already done and coming back on top of it and finding a way to make it more simple. Got about 9 more minutes left for this demo, and then I'll pick up another one. I'm going to get down much more paint here. I'm going to push the boundary of a contour. You can kind of like balloon it outward from the inside just by wagging the brush around. It's easy to get tunnel vision, so if you're only staring at positive shapes, look at adjacent negative shapes. For example, I'm looking at the triangle in between his wrist and the staff here. Values that are similar are going to blend together when you squint. So that's a really important thing to think about. Like the ways to keep things simple are to let values collapse into one another and only describe them when they're necessary. Only to make them as distinct as they appear, but don't exaggerate them. Now I'm going to get much darker in the rib cage here to really push the kind of dark and light. Rake through the adjacent values to get a softer edge. In fact, I may come back with the 30% back into the forearm here. It's especially dark right as the wrist bends here, so I want to kind of make this more distinct. And then it disappears. The bony elements are going to be protruding. They're going to catch the shadows. Yeah, this thing does not want to stick. Remember that as you paint into a wet surface, it's going to pick up some of the tone that's already down there. You can use that to your advantage. It's important to have varieties in the darks. You really want there to be transition. Though some of the darkest masses are going to be fairly flat and dark. Might suggest the nipples at this point, just so I can know where they are. the belly is turning, so this is a terminator shadow, but then it's casting a shadow on the lap. And this is an occlusion as well. Occlusion is where a form is being hidden or tucked behind. So these occlusions are normally the sharpest detail, like highlights and shadows, or occlusions are usually the sharpest shapes. They exist like under the armpits, under the breast, under the belly, the corner of the mouth, the eyelids. Those areas are usually considered to be like the most detailed. Get familiar drawing directly with the brush. The brush is the most sophisticated drawing tool. It's a very responsive, very flexible tool. So get comfortable with it. Learn how to add and take paint away from a surface using just the brush. Learn to draw directly with it. Okay. Move down into the feet, perhaps down here. This back foot is just barely seen, so I'm really looking at it as it relates to the foregrounded foot. It gets a little bit darker in here, but I haven't painted much of the floor. But I do want to tuck some shadowing underneath this calf here and kind of round out the muscle of the calf. So I have this foundation, this middle value. I'm going to punch in a darker value and just sculpt around the muscle that's being compressed. This is basically the idea. I would say you're going to want to spend as much time as it takes. Probably take you about 6 hours to get one of these paintings done. I'm working 22 by 30, and so there might be it might be easier for you to work smaller, but it also might be more difficult because of the shape sizes that you need to achieve are smaller. So consider using positive and negative shapes to kind of sculpt those smaller aspects. So let's punch it down into the 10% range. This is much darker. This is near black. Very, very close to black. And so let's bring this into the shadow masses just to get the full range of value. See one of the darkest areas is here in the sternum, and it kind of comes right up to the ulna here, and then the 10 might be a little bit too dark, but it's okay. Let's just see how it looks. As I'm working into the wet value, it's kind of picking up and mixing on the canvas. So I'm using that to my advantage. I might make a mixture in between the 30 and the 10, so I'm making a, what is that? $20 here. Yeah, here's a 20. I'll try that. That looks better to me, I think. You're killing me. This is killing me. Okay. it's okay if you go too far. You can always come back in with the adjacent values and kind of shape things up more carefully. Might bring this back into the face a little bit. So I'll make sure that the tape is stuck for the next one. I think you guys get the idea. It's important to not place the nipple in too soon, otherwise you really want to get the volume of the mass underneath. So if you're painting a breast, for example, like don't put the nipples down first. Try to model the volume first, and then the nipple itself can be kind of placed on top, kind of like the cherry on a sundae. Okay, that didn't work. Okay, I'm going to stop here and then fix my situation, and I'll start a new demo.